Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcasts with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. My guest is John Prisco. He's the CEO of Quantum XC, or Quantum Xchange. So, John, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about Quantum Xchange. It looks like, based on the news, that you were able to achieve essentially a quantum connection or an unhackable communication line. But tell me a little bit more first about the company, and then we'll talk about the achievement.
I'd be happy to. So Quantum Xchange is a quantum communications network, and it uses quantum key distribution to secure the channel. Basically, what we're doing is sending optical keys across dark fiber optics, and those keys are almost impossible to hack because they will change their state if somebody tries to eavesdrop on them. And that is a property of physics. So, unlike current cryptography, which relies on it being very difficult to factor large numbers into prime numbers, this is relying upon a law of physics and will be impervious to the coming quantum computers.
Well, when you say a law of physics, what is this, Heisenbergs uncertainty principle?
It is.
Can you explain in layman's terms how this works?
Sure. It just means that if you are trying to observe, for example, a photon, which is the particle description of light, if you try to observe that photon, the mere attempt at observing it will either change its momentum or its location. And for a quantum key, that means it's going to change one of the states that you're relying on to create the quantum key. So it's essentially a self-correcting key. So if anybody tries to intercept it, whatever they intercept will no longer be the key, and it will no longer work to decrypt the data.
Well, how does the sender and the recipient how is the key created and how is the key shared so that only the recipient can get it? Is there like some sort of entanglement where, at the outset, certain parties are involved in the entanglement and then no others can ever be involved, or how does it work?
Well, entanglement is one way of doing it, and that is known as the E91 Protocol. We're using BB84 Protocol, which looks at the phase of the photons. So essentially what you're doing is you're at two distant points, and the key is never transmitted all at once. So, for example, the way public key cryptography works, you're sending either a public or a private key from point A to point B, and if someone is able to intercept your communications, meaning intercept the data plus the key, they'll be able to decrypt the message. In this case, you're basically deriving the key a bit at a time. So you're transmitting single photons down an optical fiber, and you're agreeing as to whether each photon is a 1 or a 0. So the key basically appears at points A and B simultaneously. And, some people refer to that, at least in the entanglement world, as teleportation.
Is this because the act of observing the photon or characterizing it is what makes it, for instance, like you said, a 1 or a 0, but its state it's in two different states or multiple states before the observation?
Well, it can be in either a 1 or a 0 state simultaneously, but in this case, when you're transmitting a photon at a time, if the photon is transmitted correctly, you'll be able to receive a 1 or a 0. If it's in any way perturbed, the 1 or a 0 won't appear. It'll be some random state. So essentially, the key gets between points A and B with a guarantee that it hasn't been tampered with. Because if it has been tampered with, it just doesn't get there.
So I don't know if this is a good analogy, but I guess it's like transporting something that's so fragile that if anyone touches it, it'll break. So the only person that could touch it is the recipient. The act of them touching it allows them to receive it, but again, it just can't be messed with in the interim.
Well, I think that is a good way to think of it.
Thinking of this scheme is great, but I would bet that other people are thinking, all right, how can we get around this? Is there any idea in your mind, or is that proprietary? Is there any way to circumvent this? Or do you think it'll be the ultimate communication where it's unbreakable or interceptable?
Well, in this case, because we're relying on a law of physics, it's essentially unbreakable. However, there is a finite probability that you could guess, but it's really it might be easier to win the Powerball lottery. Because what you'd have to do, for example, when I'm sending a key, let's say I send 1 million photons from point A to point B, and I decide that I'm going to keep 100,000 of them. You would have to guess the correct orientation of the other 900,000 photons in order to know for sure that you got my key. So, being able to flip a coin and guess head or tails 900,000 times in a row correctly is what you'd have to do. And it's pretty safe to say that it's unlikely that anybody could do that.
Well, as computing speeds up, though, and becomes more powerful, how big is the space of possible answers that could comprise a key? And could you selectively, I guess, for lack of a better word, like poke at a communication and maybe disturb a few of the photons out of all of them and, reduce the guess space size to a point where you could use computers to figure it out?
Well, not really, because again, the observation is going to change the state. So if you do observe or try to observe the key, it's not going to be usable. So that won't work. But the way quantum computers are going to break public key cryptography is by being able to do what today would take today's computers a billion years to do, and that is factor a very, very large number into 2 prime numbers. And while that's difficult math, it's only difficult because we don't have the compute power to do it today. But in the next few years, when a quantum computer is, and not just any quantum computer, it has to be what we call a prime quantum computer, or one that is fast enough to be able to do this sort of factoring. Once that's available, the key could be broken in a matter of seconds. So, it's just 2 different things. No matter how much compute power you throw at the law of physics, you're not going to be able to violate that law.
But in the transmission of a message, using photons, I would think there would be an error rate. Is there any error correction needed? And is there an error rate? And how does that factor in?
Well, certainly with quantum computers that are measured in terms of qubits, like I think Google reported a 72-qubit quantum computer, there has to be a lot of error correction in that kind of a device in order for those to behave as logical qubits. That's not the case here, and I'll tell you why. So, for example, when you're transmitting a telecommunications signal or any data down an optical fiber, there is a measure of what's called bit error rate. It's usually, like 10 to the minus 9 per second or 10 to the minus 11, some very, very low error rate. But that's when you're sending a bright laser down an optical fiber. When you're sending single photons down the optical fiber, any of those photons that you tap, and it is possible to tap an optical fiber, but any that you tap don't make it to the end. So it's evident that somebody's tampered with it. So bit error rate doesn't really enter into this. It's either there or it isn't. If you take some of the photons, they don't make it to the other end, so I know you've tampered with them.
Oh, so there's not such an error rate that even if I only tampered with 1% of them, that would be enough to tell you that there was outside influence?
Yes.
I was thinking, what if the error rate's 2% or 1%? And I stay below that threshold or at it,
No, every one that you tamper with, I'll be able to know.
Huh.
Even if you tampered with just one photon, I'd be able to see that.
So what do you think it's going to look like in actual practice when these kind of communications are available and they're widespread? I mean, I would think that no matter what anyone says, people would try to tamper with them regardless. So I would think that you'd see always the background level of people poking them and try to figure stuff out. I don't think they would just give up.
Yeah, I do believe that a number of attempts have been made to do this, and the equipment has been, able to withstand these attacks. You hear of side channel attacks and people trying to tap the fiber. It really looks like it will be very difficult. It's not impossible. I mean, if you're going to be able to guess what the state of the photons are in as they're coming across, but that's only a mathematical non-zero probability. It's really, really hard to do this, and we don't know of a way. We don't know of a way that it can be broken at the moment.
Well, as a certain channel gets used over and over and over, I would think that the sender and the sender would use. I remember with Morse code, people had a fist. They had a certain way that they would do Morse code, certain spacing and all that, and speed. And do you think something like that might show up with this kind of communication? If I use a channel, 10 million times, I would bet that I would tend to use it in a certain way versus how someone else would use it. Maybe there's a signal there.
Well, there's something else going on here, and that's quantum random number generators. So, keys, the goodness and quality of a cryptographic key has to do with the randomness or the entropy generating that key. And with QKD systems, we have quantum random number generators. And again, they work on photonics principles. So, it's fairly simple to see how this works. It's again, if you take a beam splitter and shine a light on the beam splitter, half the light goes one way, half the light goes the other way, if it's a 50% beam splitter. And that's okay when you've got a bright laser beam. That's the way it will work, 50-50. But now let's say I no longer look at the wave nature of light, but I begin looking at the particle nature of light. So now I'm sending individual photons, and they hit that 50-50 beam splitter, and now, I defy anyone to predict which way the photon's going to go. It'll either go straight through or it'll be deflected. But because it's now behaving as a particle, it's not going to be 50% going through, 50% being deflected. It's going to be truly random. And it's really one of the best sources, if not the best source, of entropy for generating a cryptographic key. So, that having that amount of entropy puts you way ahead of the game to start with. So even if you use the channel, a trillion times, you're going to have a different pattern every time.
Okay, very good. So what's going to be the implication? How soon will these communication channels be available to companies, and what do you think is going to be the implications and the fallout from this? Positive or negative?
Sure. Well, certainly quantum computers have a lot of positive uses, in pharmaceuticals and all sorts of mathematical optimization problems that are fairly impossible to do today. But in the case of using QKD as the defensive weapon against the quantum computer, which is the offensive weapon in this use case, what I see happening is people are going to begin adopting quantum keys in their cryptographic strategy now, primarily because of the harvesting that's going on by nefarious actors. So, people are stealing data today. It's pretty easy to do. We read about it every week. And then they're holding on to that data because it's really cheap to store data, and wait until they have the ability to to factor the public key or the private key that goes along with that data file. So it's not a question of, quantum computers may be 5 years away or 10 years away. By the way, I don't think they're that long in that far in the distance. I think they're probably more in the 3 to 5 year range. But it doesn't matter if they're here in 3, 5, or 10 years, because if you have data that has a long shelf life, like medical records, if I steal those now and I can't read them because I can't break the key, I'll hold on to them until I have something that will break that key. So you really have to protect yourself today, and the best way to do that is with a quantum key.
Do you see a sea change over the next several years of people all migrating over to quantum communications, and what kind of infrastructure will be needed to do this? How do you even do this? Is it with simple equipment, or is it really highly specialized stuff?
Well, first of all, the networks are in place. So we bought 800 miles of dark fiber between Boston and Washington, D.C., and we've activated the first 30 kilometers of that network between Lower Manhattan and New Jersey for the financial securities market. I believe that the quantum key engines that are available have been in use for several years now, and this is no longer a laboratory experiment or a science project. This is now proven technology that is stable. It doesn't need to be cooled down to 0.4 degrees Kelvin and have a huge vacuum on it, which a lot of this equipment needed. And it also has the ability to be transmitted longer distances. We have a trusted node technology that lets us transmit quantum keys down multiples of 100 kilometers along our network. It used to be that you could only send a photon down a fiber for about 100 kilometers, but with the ability to re-amplify the signal without causing its change of state, which is requires a lot of intellectual property application, you are able to transmit these keys longer distances. So having overcome that problem, having readily available dark fiber throughout the world and certainly throughout the United States, we think that people will begin migrating to this form of protection. And why not? I mean, it's something that works today, and it is an insurance policy that I don't believe companies can afford to not partake of.
Mm. So at what point do you think there'll be off-the-shelf simple equipment that can do this, maybe even through a smartphone, or is that never going to be possible? I mean, how much of a gap is there between the equipment needed to do it right now and the equipment that we use to just communicate regularly, for instance, a smartphone?
Sure. Well, I never say never, but for now, equipment is readily available to do the network side of this. So, for example, if you were looking at securing a 5G cellular telephone network, you would initially secure the fiber between the cell towers. So the high density traffic. Will there be the ability to receive quantum keys into our cell phone someday? That I can't predict, but I never say never. But in fact, today there is equipment that is readily deployable. We're deploying it that can provide this level of protection.
Okay. Well, very good. So what's the best way for interested folks to get in contact and find out more about what you're doing?
Well, certainly they can go to our website, which is just quantumxc.com, and pick the phone up and call us. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about it.
Okay. One question I wanted to ask, probably a real doozy, but I don't even know if you can comment on it. But politically, what do you think that this is going to do, or how is it going to affect governments and communications over the next few years?
Well, I think that's really a good question, and we have experience with the provider of our hardware, who in Geneva, Switzerland, was securing the communications for their elections. And, that's certainly something that we should consider, because any critical communications path can be improved and protected if the data being sent over that path is done with quantum key encryption. So, that's certainly timely with the fear of foreign interference in elections. And, here's a use case that actually did happen and was actually done in Geneva by one of our partners.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, I appreciate your thoughts on it. So, yeah, thanks for coming on the podcast. And, listeners now have a way to contact you. So, thanks for your good work. And it'll be interesting to see how the quantum communications, filter into the everyday world.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.